The MI6 knows it, the CIA knows it, the BND, the ZM Bureau, as well as the Russian organization. And we have to join hands in a political, economic, intelligence-wise and operation-wise effort to defeat terrorism. And if we are determined, it will work and we will prevail.
It goes, of course, beyond terrorism. We saw in the past with Lockerbie and the strikes against Libya that the actual direct peace process or the search for peace in the Middle East does get involved in this. What do you think the consequences for this will be on the ground, assuming there is a Middle East connection, for what the Israeli government is currently trying to do and the sort of response?
Believe me, it is an insult to the death toll, to human suffering that is carried now by America, to connect it in these terms. You know, I spent decades of my life fighting personally with my 10 fingers together with colleagues against terror. And I happened to be a prime minister when we were ready, for the first time in the history of the Middle Eastern conflict, to put on the table an offer well within the world interpretation of 242 and 338 in order to put an end to it. The Palestinians refused even to negotiate it and turned deliberately to terror. So somehow it's totally irrelevant.
Well, it's not, is it? Surely if the response is terror and there's the sort of response to terror which you called for, it will actually strengthen the state of Israel.
No, these terror thugs and rogue leaders are very skillful in reading cracks in the staying power of leaders of the free world, be it an Israelis or others. And once we are facing with this head-on collision with terror thugs and rogue leaders, we have no choice but to stand firm, to put aside for the moment their overall arguments. The better could be a better world, but it will not be if the democracies will yield to terror. And I know the Americans. They are tough people, the same as you were under pressure. And I'm fully confident that President Bush, together with people that I know for many years, Vice President Cheney is a tough man, General Powell is a tough man, Director of CIA, George Kennedy is a tough man. They will know what to do. And they deserve the support of the whole world in a concerted effort to defeat terror.
Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian leader, has condemned what's gone on today. Do you accept that? Do you accept that and respect that?
I praise his condemnation, but it's in a way coming from a person that was so deeply involved in encouraging terror all along his life, and including these last very months, that I don't think that this is the real important event in this regard.
Moving on, we know the reputation of the security forces from Israel. Are you surprised that this has happened in the United States? It does seem an enormous failure by supposedly the most powerful nation in the world that this could happen.
It's not a failure. All our civilization is exposed by its very sophistication and openness, is highly exposed and vulnerable to terror attacks. In fact, there was an attack on the Twin Towers years ago. There was an attempt to explode the Holland Tunnel that leads into Manhattan, but I should admit that no one imagined until now the kind of combined, simultaneous effort to bring down the Twin Towers and do the rest of it.
And also to attack the Pentagon 1 hour.
That's Ehu Barak with the Israeli perspective, very worried and concerned, of course. But let's quickly go back to the US and hear from Fox about the evacuation of Lower Manhattan.
Well, first we have to support the president, who I think made a very, very important statement that we're not going to tolerate this. We have to pray for the victims. I think this is a time when the country needs to come together. This is an unbelievable tragedy. It looks like the work of Osama bin Laden, who I had tried to extradite several years ago from Afghanistan as UN ambassador. It's a coordinated attack. I think we have to get the best intelligence we can from our allies and friends around the world, and then basically plan a huge, massive response against these perpetrators.
Well, as you say,
Okay, that was Fox News correspondent on the evacuation of Lower Manhattan, which, Mike, is an amazingly important thing, and what a task to have to try and to do in the circumstances.
It's an incredible task. I saw some pictures there taken from the air, and what we were looking at, you saw a stream of cars snaking themselves to the right-hand side of Manhattan as we were looking at it. Now, that would be FDR, that's Franklin D. Roosevelt Drive, which snakes all the way down the right-hand side of Manhattan. That is the main artery through Manhattan, because Manhattan, as you well know, John, is just a network of roads and of streets and avenues. The top half of Manhattan is streets and avenues, the bottom half down in Greenwich Village, down towards Wall Street and the financial centre. They have names of roads, but nevertheless it's still a crisscross of streets and avenues. Now, to get up through Manhattan is almost impossible in the middle of Manhattan. Each block has traffic lights on it, so on each block there are 10 blocks to the mile, and there are blocks from 1 to 196 in Manhattan once you've got out of the financial district and Greenwich Village. So you can see it's about 12 miles long, Manhattan, and to get up through the middle of Manhattan, and you've got, remember, starting on the financial district at the bottom, Midtown Manhattan, and then up to Harlem at the top, and then you go over the bridges into the rest of both New York as a city, 5 boroughs altogether, and to New York State. Now, what Franklin D. Roosevelt Drive does on the right, it was a purpose-built road attached to the side of Manhattan. A lot of it overhangs the East River, and so you get onto that, and it's a fast motorway. It's called either the Drive or FDR or the Highway. And it's a fast way up round Manhattan to miss out all the traffic in the middle, to miss out all the streets and avenues, and get you out of New York swiftly. And once you've got to the top of Manhattan, you'll either then go over to Queens, perhaps, or you might go up to Upper New York State, or you might head for Connecticut. Most people in Manhattan have got people, friends, relatives, who live in either New York State, upstate, up towards Albany, which is the capital of New York State, not New York as many people think, or they'll head into Queens, the other borough of Manhattan. People who live in Staten Island, which is another borough of Manhattan, will not be able to get home tonight because all the ferries to Staten Island go from South Manhattan. So this evacuation, which is taking place, is to channel people north of Manhattan, to the north of Manhattan itself, and then beyond into New York State, Connecticut, Queens, Long Island, down to the Hamptons. Perhaps some of those richer people who live in the financial district will have homes out in the Hamptons, which is the summer houses they've just come back from because summer's just ended in America. A complete evacuation, from what I can see, of that lower part of Manhattan.
Well, it's a frightening scene you described, Mike, and one of horror, but the question is there anything we could have done, anything the US could have done to prevent it? As Ehud Barak was saying just a few minutes ago live here on Talksport, there probably isn't. It's the very openness and freedom of the societies in which we live that means we are vulnerable to this kind of attack. Chris Brown's the Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics, and Chris kindly joins us now. Well, Chris, looking at this and bearing in mind the threat from Osama bin Laden and his organisation, they threatened just 3 weeks ago to intensify the campaign. Is there anything that could have been done to stop this kind of attack?
Well, can I just back off slightly, because I don't think we should automatically assume that we're talking about bin Laden or a group like that. I think you're probably right, that's probable, but it's not certain. And recall the Oklahoma City bombing, where everybody jumped to the assumption that this was Arab terrorism, and of course it turned out not to be. So we shouldn't go too quickly on that. But getting to your main point, I think it is quite difficult. If you look at what's happened here, we've had 4 planes which were hijacked simultaneously. It takes a lot of organisation, and obviously you need 4 pilots and you need groups of people. None of the planes were very large. They didn't have large numbers of passengers. There were fewer than the passengers on one big jumbo jet in all 4 taken together. So, and it doesn't take a lot of very high technology to do that. What you need is groups of determined people as passengers, pilots, and people who are, of course, prepared to commit suicide. So it's difficult to know quite what you can do about that. However, but again, airport security in the United States, especially for internal flights, simply, I think, isn't as good as it is in many European capitals, partly because Americans use internal flights so much. People are used in America to turning up at half an hour's notice, getting on a plane and being able to fly across the country, and the kind of security that we take for granted in British airports, for example, simply isn't there a lot of the time in the US. I'm sure it will be in the future.
Yeah, Chris, I tend to agree with you because I've flown many a time from New York and got on the plane 20 minutes before it's taken off, and I know what you're talking about. Now, Chris, just ask me this. I'm not pointing the finger at all at the United States of America. I'm a big defender of America. I lived there for 3 years. But are we not supposed to believe that when we're safely tucked up in our beds at night in America, that the CIA and the FBI are aware of evil people plotting to bring our country down? I mean, this is an incredulous attack today. Nobody could have envisaged it. But aren't we supposed to be safe in the knowledge that the CIA have got their fingers on all the pulse beats of terrorism internally in the United States?
Well, you'd like to think that, wouldn't you? But, I mean, on the other hand, again, I'm not an anti-American, but let's translate it into British terms. We've had a terrorist campaign going over here in Britain for the last 25 years. Admittedly, the scale of this single act is greater than everything that's happened in Northern Ireland throughout that time. But the fact that we've had a lot of resources put into that hasn't stopped attacks taking place. It's our societies are enormously vulnerable. What you're talking about is protecting every aircraft that ever flies, but also, you see, the targets get chosen by the terrorists. So if you could protect the World Trade Center, then they can attack some other building. There are other methods. It's very, very difficult. That's one of the reasons, if I could get back to something that was being said earlier from Israel, I think it's incredibly important that the United States finds out who did this and that they take appropriate steps. But it's also tremendously important that they don't overreact. You've got to look at this as a two-pronged process. You have to punish people who do this, but you also have to address the underlying issues. And if there's one thing I would have thought that the history of the last few months or few years or few decades in the Middle East suggests is that if you come down very hard on Arab terrorism, they come back again. It only takes 20 people who are prepared to die to do this kind of operation. It's very difficult to stop that simply by police measures. You've also got to address the political issues.
Sure. Now, Chris, you've used the expression, and other people have this afternoon, if you get determined people, there's almost nothing you can do to counter it. How determined are these people, and what frame of mind are they in when they're minutes away from knowing they're going to sacrifice their own lives for what they think is a greater good, an attack on the United States?
Exactly so. I mean, how determined are they? Well, they're determined enough to fly an aircraft into a building, knowing they're going to die. And the people who do the same thing with suicide bombs. Yeah, I think there's no doubt. That's one of the reasons I think on this occasion when people are kind of assuming an Arab Middle Eastern dimension, because generally speaking, suicide bombers have some kind of religious understanding behind it. Not, I should add, that this isn't anything other than a perversion of Islam, which clearly is not a religion that encourages mass murder. But clearly the people concerned do believe that they will be transported to paradise as a result of doing this.
Well, Chris, thank you very much for joining us. That's Chris Brown, the Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics. This is Talksport on a black day for mankind. Let me remind you, there is an emergency number that you can call, and that is 0207 008 0000. One more time, it's 020 700 80000. Now, earlier on, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine was said to have claimed responsibility for today's terrorist attacks, but that has been half dismissed, and the fingers at the moment are pointing at Osama bin Laden. That's certainly the latest out of Washington, the Islamic fundamentalist bin Laden. More on him later on. He is said to be most likely to be behind the attack. But if you're just coming in and you haven't heard the details, they are terrible details. Let's go away now. More details from the Sky News Centre and Martin Smedley.
Thank you. There's been an incredible and devastating wave of terrorist attacks across the United States. 2 hijacked planes crashed into and destroyed the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York. There could have been around 20,000 people inside the buildings. A third hit the Pentagon in Washington, and a commercial plane's gone down near Pittsburgh. American fighter aircraft are now patrolling the skies, ready to shoot down any more terrorist planes. The loss of life has been described as tremendous. Sky's Matthew Farrell has been looking at the timetable of terror that struck the United States.
Just before 2 o'clock our time, the first jet airliner crashes into the World Trade Center in New York. TV networks start flashing the dramatic pictures almost immediately. Just minutes later, a second plane crashes into the second tower, causing a devastating explosion seen on screens around the world. It quickly emerges that the FBI is investigating reports of a plane being hijacked before the World Trade Center crashes. At 2:30 UK time, US President George Bush